I think we can get started. So I'm super excited to host this panel today. Really excited to be joined by Matt, Mike, and Richie. So we're going to be talking about trends in spend. So taking a look at advertising trends now, kind of a quick look back to what happened in that sort of integral period when I guess the world turned upside down and COVID started, and then some projections for the future. We're also going to be talking about contextual advertising and the role that that can play, especially within video, and the current ecosystem that we're in. So before we jump into the content and before we do quick introductions, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. So number one, if we have any tech issues or if Zoom decides to make any updates that are unexpected, feel free to just put that into the chat, and Avery or myself, she has the beautiful background, will be able to help. We're gonna do a quick QA or questions and answers at the end of the session. So any questions that you guys have for myself or the other panelists, just drop them into the chat and we're gonna cover them off at the end. And then as I mentioned before, for anybody who joined early, we really wanna get a gauge on everybody's outlook for the remainder of 2020. So what do you guys think the rest of the year has to hold? If you use your camera app, you can access the QR code and it will take you to a poll. So please vote, tell us what you think, and we're then going to be asking each of the panelists at the end what their own personal point of view is for the remainder of the year. Cool. So before we get started, some quick introductions. I'm Johanna. I head up business development at Exco. For those of you who don't know us, we provide publishers with really unique dynamic video content, as well as a robust monetization solution through a unique video player solution. Alongside me today, we have Richie Hayden, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. My last name is definitely one that gets any sort of moderator or panelist shivering with fear. So he's a co-founder and CEO of Iris TV, a real expert in everything to do with AI, video, contextuality, and contextual advertising. And I think to kind of kick things off, Richie, where are you based today? Where have you been quarantining for the last couple of months?
So I'm currently in New Jersey, in a beach town called Avalon. I've been quarantining a mix between here in New Jersey and in Los Angeles, where I'm based.
Nice, that's awesome. And alongside you, I can see we have Mike. So Mike is the VP of Advanced TV and Audio at Essence. He's been in the industry for a really long time, working very closely with his advertising clients on anything to do with advanced TV and new innovative solutions. And I'm gonna ask him the same thing. I noticed you have the same background to the last time we spoke. So where have you been quarantining?
I am in my bedroom up in Westchester.
Nice. And I'm in the middle of South Dakota.
Oh, wow.
Basically in the middle of nowhere. I managed to find the best Wi-Fi connection for this panel that South Dakota has available. And then last but not least, we have Matt Clark, who's the VP of Partnerships at Beeswax. Really excited to have him here today as well. He really brings to the table a lot of interesting data. He pulled some really cool insights that we're gonna discuss today, looking at sort of the trends. And I'm excited to have him here as well. And Matt, I can't see you currently, but where are you quarantining?
Yeah, I'm also in Westchester County, just north of New York City. So I've been here pretty much the whole time.
Nice. Cool. So let's jump straight in. So I thought sort of a good place to start the conversation today was taking a quick look back at sort of what happened from that initial date when I guess COVID kind of turned the world upside down. So I have circled in all of my own sort of calendars both personal and professional forecast, any revenue performance data, March 12th as the date when sort of the world turned upside down. So kind of to kick things off, Matt, I know you pulled some really cool insights looking at kind of the shutdown and what happened. So I kind of want to kick off with you. What are some of the insights that you've seen in that sort of initial period between March and May, and then comparing that to where we're now in June?
Sure. So one of the things we pulled together for this panel was a look at across the Beeswax platform. So this is limited to Beeswax customers and their, and in some cases their advertiser customers. How has spend changed across different regions of the United States, and how does that compare to when different regions of the United States had differing impacts or shutdowns or various things? And so rather than pull out all 50 states, we decided we would take 2 states that I think it's safe to say have had very different coronavirus experiences and also very different government and societal and economic responses to coronavirus. And that's New York State versus the state of Texas. So in this graph, what you see is spend indexed to 100% starting at, so there's no actual spend numbers. We wanted to compare rate of change for everybody. Starting on the 1st of March and carrying through the end of April. And what you see here is right about the time that New York City really started to lock down, which was right about the middle of March, you see this massive drop in ad spend, and this is national advertisers, local advertisers, regional advertisers, a mix, in response to what was an effective, significant drop in economic activity in New York City and in the surrounding counties. And I just think it's interesting to point out that advertisers, at least the programmatic advertisers who use our platform, are generally very responsive to what they see as the near-term ability of consumers to respond economically to the offers that are being put in front of them. And so you see that, the decrease in ad spend across the entire USA continues throughout the end of March. But in New York State, where I think you can't really argue that New York State was harder hit than most of the country, at least in the early phases, you also see that ad spend is harder hit as well. And then, after that initial period, the rest of the country effectively catches up from a rate of change perspective.
It's super interesting, I think, to see how reactive and kind of like how real time the programmatic spend kind of reacted. So sort of like near to the day when some of that initial news around sort of, I think, the moment everybody realized like the real impact of COVID and sort of the peripheral news from like China kind of became a reality for the US. So kind of kicking things over to Mike and Richie, how does that kind of align with some of the, what you've been hearing from your clients, and also anything that you've seen across your platform, Richie?
Yeah, I think on our end, maybe to sort of flip the coin a little bit to like what are consumers doing, which is obviously driving a lot of the consumption data that advertisers and that inventory that advertisers can reach. There's sort of 3 main things that we've seen. Number one, I think is very obvious, a huge increase in volume, right? Obviously the amount of streaming has just exploded. So huge increase in inventory. Number 2 is a change in the device consumption. So we saw from our total, global inventory, a change from desktop consumption being about 30% of overall volume, jumping very quickly in under a 60-day period to about 50+% of consumption as consumers obviously moved home and obviously stopped commuting and their travel changes. And then number 3 was really a huge change in the types of content that they were consuming. So obviously we have a big focus on contextual, less from the perspective of creating the contextual segment, but more from running the platform that enables contextual for video. So there's a couple, obviously you can see some of the stats here, but a couple of the quick things that we saw was, a big decline in news. Big increase in news. From about 12% to 20+% of overall volume. Obviously, with the shutdown and removing and closing down all the sports content, huge decline in the amount of inventory there for sports viewing. And so I think it's really interesting when you think about what the advertising ecosystem is doing. Everything is cyclical. It's driven by, known and unknown events. Something like the sports, sector has obviously been affected in a really big way. So those are kind of some of the initial trends that we saw when COVID started. A couple of quick things that we've seen more recently is sports is picking up. We've got consumption increasing as we've got the NBA and MLB season starting to open up. Hopefully, fingers crossed that does occur. We've got the European soccer leagues, opened up, so we're seeing international traffic increases, especially in the EMEA region. Obviously a lot of TBD statuses here in the US around college sports and other elements. So, kind of a swing back already in a consumption volume for sports. And what we're seeing come with that is big brands that, the Nikes and the Adidas of the world, who obviously are putting a lot of dollars to work, and now trying to figure out how do we introduce, advertising back in different ways, right? We've got big digital consumption audiences, but no in stadium viewing, and that's a big change for them. So, couple quick things that we've seen there, mostly on the supply side.
Cool. Yeah, really interesting. Just looking at the stats, really interesting on the sports. It actually completely marries up with what we've seen across our network. So both in terms of traffic volumes from partners, but also looking at some of those segments across verticals, especially with news, very, very similar trend. So kind of taking it back to, want to go back to Matt's slide, kind of looking back at the reopening. So I know he took a quick look at, okay, what happened immediately in terms of programmatic spend when the full shutdown started. So he also pulled some really cool stats around sort of the reopening. So Matt, would you mind talking everybody kind of through the insight that you were able to draw there?
Sure. Yeah. So this shows the same figure, which is spend indexed to 100% for the same three regions: Texas, New York State, and rest of country added together. And we picked 5/1 as the start date here because that's the day that that all of the mandatory lockdowns, a state of emergency in the state of Texas, expired. So we wanted to see, okay, well, what happens to ad spend as a result of that? And what you can see here is, again, advertisers being incredibly responsive. The growth rate of ad spend in Texas from the day those lockdowns expired dramatically outpaces, if you look at this graph, it's by 2.5x, both New York State and the rest of the country. And New York State really, apart from some, random aberrations in here, is pacing along with the rest of the country. Now, the other, again, just to point to the responsiveness of advertisers to economic conditions, the other date I want to point out here is right towards the end of June, beginning of July, because two different things are happening almost at the same time. As we're getting towards the end of June, New York City was getting ready to go from phase 2 to phase 3 reopening, which is a big boost in general, just people being out, economic activity, et cetera. And so what you see is that orange line starting to creep up. Advertisers are starting to bias their spend back towards inventory in New York City. And we surmise that's in advance of the phase 3 reopening. At the same time, what you've seen in Texas is that Texas has had a surge in coronavirus cases since then. And at almost exactly that same time, around July 1st, is when Texas started to announce that they were having to reclose a number of things. And what you see is that the heavy growth rates you'd seen in spend in Texas crashed dramatically right about the time that news is announced. And so again, it just points to the fact that advertisers are being responsive to those conditions and directing their spend towards the areas where they think they're going to find an audience that's the most receptive.
It's so fascinating, and kind of like, I've been on this road trip. I've ironically gone to the States where they were in sort of phase 3, and then kind of left when sort of that fear of the numbers increasing, and kind of just having been kind of across the whole US for the last couple of weeks. It's really interesting to see the states where you can really tell people, as soon as the states are opening up more, everybody's flocking to restaurants. And it would seem that really advertisers, at least in real time, are then pushing spend, towards those areas of more economic activity. And Mike, being, I guess, kind of representing, I guess, the closest to the client and the client perspective from an advertiser point of view. How are you, I guess, counseling or advising your clients when it comes to looking at the phased reopening? Are you kind of looking at that from like a state-by-state perspective?
I don't necessarily know if we're looking at it from a state-by-state perspective. I think, our role in the ecosystem is really to advise our clients on what the best way for them to be reaching their targets are. And then I think that as the market is continuing to evolve, both as things reopen or as things close, or as, even more importantly, people's content consumption or buying consumption habits start to evolve to match up with what we're seeing happening nationally. It's really our role to continue to surface relevant opportunities for our clients to reach their audiences, no matter where they are or how they're watching. So like we've talked a little bit about mobile, and we've talked a little bit about the shift to desktop. But people are home right now, which means that mobile traffic is down. It means that web traffic is going to be up. And it means that people are, whether or not they're working from home, probably consuming media content differently, either at different times or different types of content. I know personally, I have an hour and a half commute into the city and out of the city every day. I'm a big podcast guy. I have 45 episodes of my favorite podcast that I haven't listened to because I'm not sitting on the train in a captive environment. There's all sorts of different media consumption vehicles that I have at home beyond just the need to use podcasting.
Yeah.
So it's really still taking that audience-based approach, finding the same users, finding the same viewers, finding the same listeners, reaching them with their relevant messaging inside of relevant content, but knowing that it may be different messaging and different content than what we were doing 6 months ago.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I'm sure you guys kind of find yourself in the same schedule of being sort of stuck on a Zoom call pretty much from like 9 to 6. And I think kind of like to echo what you said, I'm a big podcaster as well. I walk to work every day. I love listening to podcasts on that walk. And that's something that I've completely cut out of my life, which is, now that I reflect on it, a shame. And I'm definitely going to think about how I can get that back. So thank you, Mike.
Now, just to add to that, for my friends who work in podcasting, I've heard the opposite as well. I've heard that there are people who are saying, I'm staring in front of my computer screen all day. The last thing I want to do between 8 and 11 is sit there and watch TV. I'm going to sit down on my couch, turn off the screen, and listen to
get outside,
audio, or go outside and do that. Right. So I don't necessarily think it's one of these things is going away. It's that there's this change in content consumption.
Cool. No, I think that's really, really interesting. And so we're now 15 days into July. So, more events happened in July. And Richie, this is definitely a question for you because I know it's really interesting. So programmatic has always been about, and to Mike's point, about reaching the right user at the right time, the right audience with the relevant message, but sort of less so about context. The Facebook ad boycott, obviously a big shift and sort of some waves in terms of how advertisers are starting to shift the sentiment around social platforms. Context is obviously very important there. And so Richie, my question for you is, have you seen any sort of early signs on kind of what that, any impact on your business at all?
Absolutely. I think we've seen it. I think the industry's seeing it. I think, the big headline here is that, context is back. It's a very, very important form of targeting data. And I think, if we'd all started on January 1st, we probably would have said, hey, it's going to take, the next 14 to 18 months. It's going to be a transitionary period. And let's all talk about, what we're going to do after the cookie dies or it changes. All of those timelines have been rapidly pushed up. Really what we're seeing from the advertiser side is that over the past, 4 months, we've obviously talked about COVID, we've got COVID hitting, a completely unheard of event that marketers don't know how to understand and how to interpret. And that brings a lot of concern and worry around what type of content your brand stands for and how you want to be associated or not associated with that types of content. So it's really important that brands have the ability to control, how they want to associate with the topic of COVID. But to hit it again, we've had obviously social injustices and other issues, going through the United States in the past, 3 months, and we've got an election this year. So it's almost like the triple whammy to go along with, the Chrome announcement, coming on the cookie side. So it's almost like the spotlight's been put on context in general. And I think for us specifically, we specialize in video, and context has been around a long time. So I think a big conversation that we've been having with the buy side is really understanding how this worked historically. So really, like, how context and brand safety targeting really works is historically it's all done based on the text on a page. Now, the way that the vendors that are in that space actually build their technology is to basically build crawlers that understand and can interpret text on a page. And the way that they access those pages is via page URLs that are sent in the bid stream. So the big, contextual companies that we all know out there mostly work with DSPs. They get their hands on pages through the bid stream, and that's really created two huge gaps for buyers that again have just been sped up in the last 4 months. Number one is that buyers are not able to, until very recently, with some of the advancements that we've released, target the topic of an actual video and determine how they want their brand advertising to run adjacent to it or to generally be associated to it. So that's one huge gap. The second is that there are no page URLs on CTV, and so context and brand safety is not present at all. So kind of a few different topics wrapped in there, a bit of history on how programmatic context targeting works, and three major economic and social events that have happened in the past 6 months, and how that's affected us really in June and July is that we're seeing increase in always on brand safe PMP requests from our buyers. Can you make sure that all of this is adjacent to everything that is not death, injury, adult, COVID, all the typical block list terms? So that's one that we've seen as a huge increase. And then the second is requests for vertical specific, private marketplaces. So big CPG brands looking to run against health, wellness, ironically, in some cases, travel, because it's really hard to reach those audiences right now. And sort of the beauty of this is that, contextual targeting is proven. It's a science, and it is actually more effective. So those are kind of some of the big things we've seen in June and July.
That's awesome. And Mike, from your perspective and obligatory DigiDay sort of poll chart here to add a little bit of some more data, but obviously sort of one of the big factors in determining for marketers to buy is making sure that it's a trusted, brand safe environment. So obviously, I think there's no doubt that the ability to target contextually really helps with that. I'd be interested to hear from your point of view, what do you see as the opportunity there, not only for advertisers, but also for publishers or content owners, or basically digital providers. So, here at Exco, across our network, like we talked about earlier, news, we've seen a huge traffic uplift in news. However, the advertising dollars haven't necessarily already followed. So I'd be interested to kind of hear your point of view on kind of the opportunity on both sides.
Right. Even before, the worst medical situation any of us on this has ever lived through, as well as, a polarized political environment and a polarized social environment right now, it is increasingly important for marketers to understand not just where to find their viewers inside of brand safe environments, but post campaign, what's working and what's not working, and knowing where they're running in both pre and post buy. So, and as Richie was alluding to, just knowing what was on the page around a piece of video content is no longer enough for marketers. They need to know what was the complete journey, exposure to content that the viewer took before seeing an ad and then potentially after seeing the ad to better understand, is it brand safe? Is it aligned with their brand? Are there competitive concerns? Is it the story that they want? Not necessarily a news story, but is the entire viewer journey a story that they want their brand associated with? And that's how brands have traditionally thought in television. There's a reason why when brands invest in television, they ask for scripts for shows. They vet where they're buying. And digital had not had those capabilities anywhere until a few years back when it became more prevalent in display. And now with Iris and the partnerships that they have with publishers, bringing that technology to video, it allows for larger budgets to be devoted to video, but also for marketers to better understand what's working and what's not working so they can continue to refine and invest.
And when you're sort of counseling or advising your clients in this space right now, it's obviously, it's changing constantly. How are you advising them in terms of some of the important topics that are going around or that are happening right now? Sort of, how do they surround themselves sort of within the important topics, but at the same time not completely alienating them from the audience? Is contextual targeting something that can really sort of help there, or is it more of a ensuring that they're sort of removing themselves from some of those topics?
So I think it's the former. It does help to continue to refine, and I think contextual targeting has its place as a standalone offering, but it's also a broader piece. It's a piece of the broader, how am I reaching my viewers? How are my clients reaching their viewers story to tell? Which is why every single thing on this Digiday chart is what our clients are looking for. And to be somewhat honest with you, they should all probably, the line should be like this because they are all equally important.
I mean, I think that's a super interesting, I think that's really interesting insight on that front. And Mike, sort of taking everything that Matt and Richie just covered, do you have any, are you obviously sitting on a huge amount of data? Are you seeing sort of any early shifts in the way that the brands are spending when it comes to sort of contextual targeting or contextual advertising?
I mean, historically, what we've seen is that contextual advertising gets used a fairly predictable amount of the time in display advertising. You know, you might see in any given month somewhere between 4 and 8% of the impressions that are bought in display, whether it's mobile or desktop, et cetera, use some kind of contextual targeting. You then turn and look at video to date. That number is it's so small it's not even really worth stating, right? It's a sub 1% of impressions that are bought use some kind of a contextual targeting product, and that's basically an admission by advertisers that all the limitations that Richie has described earlier are real and exist, and mean that URL-driven contextual products just haven't been relevant for most video buyers. And especially as we've seen more and more video on our platform shifting towards connected devices, that becomes more and more true, where at least in desktop video, there was a URL you could analyze. Whether that analysis was relevant or not was a question. At the same time, I think we've seen anecdotally, nearly every one of our connected television video buyers ask us how they can get better intelligence about where their ads are delivering. I think to Mike's point, advertisers care deeply about that, especially advertisers who are coming from a linear television spend perspective, where they're used to having extreme certainty around the content they're going to air next to. The people that come to it from a direct response display perspective are not insensitive to it, but less sensitive to it in general. But we're definitely seeing this mismatch between how much advertisers want to have intelligence, both pre and post purchase around context, and what's historically been available, especially in the connected device video space.
I think maybe not to just to add on to that. I think the last couple of points obviously very advertiser focused. I think what's also been really interesting is that for reasons driven by sort of technological difference between, analyzing a page through the bid stream and having to analyze a video owned by the publisher, it's actually very beneficial for the pubs themselves as well, right? And I think a lot of publishers, especially news groups, there's a lot of fear around contextual targeting and brand safety. It's usually not a good thing for the publisher. It usually leads to decreases in fill rates and, basically problems with journalism where you're not producing content because you actually can't make money. Like, that's bad for the democracy, right? It's a big problem. So the beauty about the way that it seems to be, rolling out for the video space is that contextual data can actually enable a publisher to represent their inventory in a differentiated way. And that has a lot of benefits to the news groups, right? I think we'd all be really surprised if we looked under the hood of a news group and understood actually what does their consumption profile look like. It's not all hard news. It's not all, right, wing or right facing, or depending on the side of the table that the group is on. And there's a lot of really valuable inventory for big brands. And so it's definitely been a great way for publishers to start to show their inventory. And that's just across the board. Very specifically on CTV, for a lot of the big free ad-supported streaming services that drive a huge amount of volume in OTT, there are some very restrictive rights around what they can and cannot sell around show and series level data. And that's for very good reason, that the networks don't want advertisers necessarily cherry picking their inventory on off-platform devices, which is absolutely fair. But we do need to give those free ad supporting streaming services some additional contextual data to leverage, so that when you've got a Pluto or a Zuma or a Fubo out there having a discussion with an advertiser, that they can slim down that package of content to things of specific topics. So lots of benefits, hopefully on both sides of the fence.
I totally agree with you, Richie. And that's kind of where I want to go next. But just before that, I think we sit across a ton of data, video content consumption data as well. And we provide publishers with really playlisted, curated content experiences. So lots of different verticals, and working with a ton of news publishers, we've also seen that challenge for them, seeing sort of huge spikes in traffic, mainly around sort of the actual article content, sometimes getting blacklisted or blocked out in terms of keywords. But actually they all now are moving towards a real always on video solution, where they want to constantly be able to engage users with relevant video content that kind of takes them further into the journey and keeps eyeballs and keeps the users really engaged with that video playlisted content, and allowing the publishers to verticalize that content, get advertisers to buy into that. I think outside sort of what you covered in terms of everything to do with hard news, it really opens up a whole new opportunity in terms of ad spend. So I think in terms of from a publisher perspective, and we kind of just covered this, some more colorful Digiday charts to kind of brighten up the day today. Like we said, so according to their research, 74% of publishers saw a drop in ad CPMs, but 50% have said that their traffic has grown more than 50%. So do you guys have any tips or advice for publishers? I can see we have a couple of our partners in the audience and a couple of big media brands who have joined us today. And I know they would find it just really interesting to hear kind of what your advice to them is in this current ecosystem that we've found ourselves in, or the new normal, shall we say.
I think that, this isn't going to be a surprise to anybody based on what I said before, but you can't just look at an impression as being an impression anymore. Not all impressions are created equal. Not all publishers or sites or ways to find that specific person are created equal. There's always going to be a mix of audience-based buying and contextual-based buying that needs to be combined in order to better understand that way to reach your audience. So similar to, just to bring it back to TV for a moment, in the old school mindset of TV buying, if you're looking to target millennial moms, you're buying daytime TV. That's how it has been for 40 years, because moms are at home during the day watching TV, taking care of the kids. in this post-COVID world, everybody's at home during the day. So using standard day part based buying to reach your target audience doesn't work anymore. Taking that one step further, using a broad women watch Bravo based approach in TV doesn't work anymore either, because that's just not true. We know that there is a large portion of men who watch Bravo. And finding those people, finding those male viewers inside of relevant content is really where you need to take that targetable and contextual approach in order to not only maximize your ability as a publisher to reach the broadest people who are broadest audiences that marketers are looking for, but also to further enhance the value of that impression and charge effectively for that, and better be able to provide the measurement to the buy side community to say, here's how we're finding people, here's how delivery is working, here's how we're proving you're finding the right people inside of content you know that they're in, or content you may not have known they were in.
And Matt, what's your point of view on that?
So my point of view is that, and it's specific to the kinds of advertisers who utilize our product, which are advertisers who want to deploy very complex, custom, algorithmic media buying at significant scale. And those advertisers are looking for more and better information to help them make better decisions, again, in an automated, scalable way. And so my advice to publishers, this is not necessarily COVID related, although perhaps COVID makes puts a finer point on it because of the economic pain that publishers might feel at the moment. But my advice is that there are finally now technologies like what Iris is doing with a pseudonymous way to give me intelligence about the content without violating any of your agreements with content providers. On the audience side, there are a variety of different ways that connected device publishers could finally give people a sense of identity, whether it's LiveRamp or any of the other identity solutions that exist. And my advice to publishers is that there's an opportunity now to be an early adopter of those technologies and help within any pool of money that's going to get spent on premium video, large format video, to preferentially direct that money your direction by providing our buyers with the kind of information that will help them know that they actually prefer that inventory.
Yeah, I think maybe one added item to put on there specifically for the publishers is also to start thinking about consumption and context together. So I think a big thing that as context takes a bigger role is really as a publisher understand what you're producing. Like, how is that categorized? What are people watching? Like, what is your supply actually made up of is step one. Step two is, okay, what are the advertisers buying? What are they looking to run against? And then really re-looking at your inventory from a yield perspective and say, well, what am I producing in the future? What am I over-indexed in, or what am I under-indexed in? And I can beef up the supply either through new production, either through syndication and content acquisition. So I think video is very expensive and very different to article-based. And I think it's important that publishers start to look at the yield of what they're creating and what the buy side is doing with that supply.
So really to kind of summarize it, it's kind of the opportunity and some of the advice is really think about sort of what you're producing and looking at how those consumption trends have changed, back to sort of Mike's point around the way that we're consuming content with everybody being at home has really changed. We're probably tuning into sort of very different type of programming based on the way that we used to consume content, and then also looking at, okay, how do I both enhance the value of what I am producing and align it with the verticals that advertisers are spending in to really maximize that strategy. I think that's amazing advice. And I think, we've talked a lot about sort of, what's happened. I think, everybody's talked about COVID probably on every single call that they've had for the last couple of months. And I think, it's one thing that's changed the world, it's turned the world upside down. We now have the new normal. We have the phased reopening, which is obviously bringing a lot of positivity, signs that the market is starting to recover in some sense. However, outside of that, we have the fear of the second wave. Richie, you touched on it, but the cookie disappearing, the Facebook ad boycott, the presidential election around the corner, probably one of the most important presidential elections that the United States has ever seen. Some of those things having positive impacts on, I guess, the economy and advertising spend, some negative. Not sort of asking you to predict the future, because this year has been a complete disaster in terms of everybody's plans at the start of the year. But what do you guys each think, what's next for Q3 and Q4? Kind of assuming all of those events are going to be a constant. Who wants to go first?
I mean, I'll give a bit of a cop-out answer, which is that I think there is a number of those events have a lot of uncertainty baked in around them, right? Like some don't. There's going to be tons of political spend no matter what happens. And in fact, if some of the uncertainty comes to pass negatively, it may increase the amount of political spend. We definitely haven't seen any clients in the political realm or clients of ours who service political advertisers. We haven't seen any of that pulling back at all. It's changed form somewhat as certain issues or candidates have leaned in harder or pulled away. But in the aggregate, it's moved forward. But to give an example, in 15 days, we're going to find out whether or not Congress is going to reauthorize expanded unemployment benefits for the entire country. That's a single binary event that, depending on how it goes, will have a massive implication on the populace's ability to spend on discretionary and staple items. And that's definitely going to impact the willingness of advertisers to lean into ad spend or not in a variety of different categories. Leaning up into the summer, we've seen home and garden advertisers pick up like they would normally. I don't think that's going to continue if all of a sudden, 30 million people can't afford to pay their rent. And so I think that there's a lot of uncertainty around those issues. In the short term, what we're seeing is that advertisers are responding very quickly to changing situations. So we've seen a resurgence in growth in travel advertising, which I didn't think we were going to see. If you'd asked me 2 months ago, when's travel advertising come back, I would have told you, February next year. But we're seeing travel advertising already kind of at about 50% of its pre-COVID peak, which is really surprising to me. And what it suggests to me is that advertisers are saying, well, I'm not totally sure what's going to happen in the future, but I know what's happening right now. So as long as I see that I can, reasonably invest some amount, given what I know now, I'm going to do it. And that we're seeing that kind of uniformly across different categories.
Yeah, and I think as people, and kind of just talking from my own personal experience, as people are looking to figure out how to still travel, but within kind of the constraints of what's been experienced. So like for myself, taking a road trip, traveling more domestically, still experiencing, the world, but in a very different way that you normally would. So kind of allowing advertisers to kind of capitalize on the way that travel has not necessarily gone away. And people are definitely still traveling more domestically, but it just seems that it's kind of just following that reactive trend on what's actually happening in the way people are reacting to the situation that we're in.
Yeah.
So Richie and Mike, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I think so maybe at sort of high level, and then maybe what we're advising clients to do. So I think sort of three things that are evident that are going to continue to occur in Q3 and 4. Number one, like COVID's not going away, whether we get unlocked slightly in different areas, and that's going to lead to a continued increase in consumption of video, right? Number one. Number two, as you said, we've got an election coming. Then obviously every election that rolls through, that introduces net new dollars into the market in a very big way. So we've got new dollars entering the market, and we've got a Facebook boycott. So we've got big dollars transitioning outside of the walled gardens and into the open market. And so given those three things, spending on video will increase, right? And with that, what our advice is to everyone, and specifically on the buy side first, is you really, at this point, you can't spend dollars in video without brand suitability. It's a huge risk on a defensive strategy side. So I think this event and all the events from the first half of the year put a huge spotlight on that for brands, that they can't continue to spend in the way that they're doing without verification as to what content they are positively or negatively running adjacent to. So I think the recommendation to the buy side is, adopt contextual targeting in a really big way now. And on the publisher side, obviously this is a data product that is fueled by the supply side. It's the first time in a long time that a data product for the ad tech ecosystem has been driven by the publisher side. So I'd say to the publisher side, adopt it, make it part of your thesis. Think about how you can differentiate your inventory to the buy side, increase your fill rates, increase your CPMs, and take it as a positive, not a negative.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Rishi said. And then to allude back to what I said earlier, just marketers need to understand that this is going to end. We are going to get through this. I am convinced we are going to get through this as a society. There's going to continue to be different ways to reach people. One of the silver linings that this has had on our industry is that it's kind of put a spotlight on all the things we've talked about today, which is the importance of better understanding where viewers are, how they're consuming content everywhere. That push towards an omni-channel marketing message that's able to fluidly follow a viewer throughout their day, not just on a set schedule, but when a wrench gets thrown into it. And that's really what the role of ad tech is in that transaction, to provide those signals and those technology points to the buy and sell sides to let us buy more effectively and let sellers sell more effectively.
I think that's completely spot on. And kind of before we get a pulse on the audience outlook on Q3 and Q4, and I love these images that we came up with. Really describes how I'm feeling. But I would say that, so I'd love each of your sort of thoughts on your outlook. I think for me personally, I'm definitely positive, sort of just everything I've experienced over the last couple of months. Positive that we are going to have a strong Q4. I think it's probably going to be a really interesting quarter. But then at the same time, I'm like, who the hell knows what is going to come next? So starting with you, Mike, what's your opinion?
So I'm meh.
How about you, Richie?
I think generally positive if we're looking at the rest of 2020 compared to the beginning of 2020. So I think we're definitely take the positive side of the spectrum. Things are going to get better. We'll get out of it.
And how about you, Mike?
I'm definitely in the who knows camp.
So a very mixed bag there. So I'm just going to jump out and see if we can get the results from the audience. So I'm going to go for, I'm going to go for definitely positive. So let's see. Oh, okay. So
bunch of pessimists in the room.
That's a very, very mixed message. I guess 50-50 with, or kind of more leaning towards the meh and positivity. I think what's really interesting is that, if you look at sort of socioeconomic factors and the drivers here, I think the more positive we are in terms of the outlook and the spend, and sort of stop being restrictive and start spending in the market again, that's ultimately going to be sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where it is going to be a better, end of year. But really, really interesting. So I think we have about 10 minutes left. So I think before we were going to do a couple of breakout sessions after this. So just a chance for people to network and talk to each of us. But before that, I wanted to just see if we had any really interesting questions that came up during the session. So let's just jump back into the chat. Okay, cool. So I can see a ton of questions. So number one, we have, number one is, does the shift to remote work, which might be the norm for the future, fundamentally change how advertisers look at spend? So I'll open that up to any one of you.
I mean, I think it clearly changes what categories of advertisers are spending more or less, right? You know, you can look at a broad category like hobbies and interests skyrocketed, and likewise, you're not seeing a lot of spending on luggage right now, and that's likely to, you know, continue for some period of time. I think that it's also clearly going to change patterns with respect to where people consume content. We've seen a massive shift away from, and Mike's mentioned this too, right? You've seen a shift away from mobile in-app video, and likewise a shift towards connected device video, because that's where consumers are spending their time. So I think it's clearly going to have an impact, in as much as it impacts the underlying consumer and how work from home changes their content consumption habits and their economic habits.
Yeah, I think also you're going to see some shifts in the formats that the advertisers are putting dollars to work. I think over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been sort of a resurgence of outdoor. I would expect, although I'm not in the outdoor space all day, every day, that's likely going to decrease or to shift dramatically. So obviously not ideal for some, depending on the side of the market you sit, but if you're a digital publisher in video or even in podcasting, hopefully that introduces net new spending and opportunities there.
How about you, Mike?
Sorry, I was on mute. I would agree with both Matt and Richie on that one. I don't necessarily have a strong point of view.
Cool. So we have about 8 minutes left. So Avery is going to help set up a couple of quick breakout sessions for just a couple of minutes networking and for any questions that anybody has. But before we do that, I wanted to say thank you so much for joining today. I thought it was just really interesting to kind of get a lot of different perspective from both the buy side, the supply side, and then also kind of sitting across both sides in terms of what we've seen in terms of trends, and also really looking at very reactive and sort of news driven events and how that's actually impacted programmatic spend. We have recorded this session, so for anyone who has any follow-up questions, we're going to be sending it around, and then feel free to reach out to any of us, and I'm sure everybody will be happy to continue the dialogue.